welcome to Church Coffee. My name is Rob, and today we have Trevor McFadden. Trevor is a DC District Federal Judge, and today we're just going to talk with him a little bit about how it is to be a federal judge. Trevor, welcome to Church Coffee.
Thanks so much for having me, Rob. It's good to be with you.
So our classic intro question is, what is your favorite coffee?
Yeah, so this might end up being a very short interview. I actually am not a coffee drinker. I survived law school and midnights as a police officer without it. I do like tea. I love sweet tea and actually Earl Grey in the winters. So I gotta kind of keep control of myself, not mainline too much tea or caffeine, but not a coffee drinker.
All right. But a warm beverage with some caffeine in it on the occasion. Excuse me. Well, you kind of already hinted at being a law officer, but why don't you give us your little story? How did you end up as a federal judge? Just a quick bio, as it were.
Sure. So I was a police officer right out of Wheaton College, but with the intent of going to law school. In fact, I'd already been accepted at University of Virginia Law School, but I was really interested in being a prosecutor down the road, and so I hoped that experience as a police officer would be useful. So I worked as a police officer for a couple of years, went to law school, actually was a part-time deputy sheriff through law school and for a time thereafter. After law school, I clerked for a federal judge and then worked in the Justice Department, first as a junior political appointee at the end of the Bush administration, and then I went over as a federal prosecutor in the DC U.S. Attorney's Office. I was there for 4 years. Then went over to a law firm doing criminal defense and compliance work largely with companies, corporate clients, and then came back to the Justice Department as a deputy assistant attorney general in the criminal division at the beginning of the Trump administration before I was nominated and eventually confirmed to the U.S. District Court in D.C.
Very cool. Just a really random aside, since you were in the Justice Department under President Trump, did you ever interact with Sarah Isgur at all?
Yes, absolutely. I know her well. She was the department spokesperson when I was the deputy assistant attorney general there, and I actually know her father, who's a bankruptcy judge in Texas.
Cool. We might get into why that might be a fun connection in a little bit. But so we're going to move on to more general just law impressions. So you said you attended Wheaton College, often called the Harvard of Christian schools, and then you attended UVA Law School. It sounded like you had already said you had an eye on the law, even being a lawyer, graduating from Wheaton. So are there any classes or professors at Wheaton that impacted your decision to attend law school?
Sure. I loved my time at Wheaton. I'd say the biggest takeaway from my time at Wheaton was learning how to the integration of faith and learning is kind of a big theme there, and thinking Christianly, if you will, about our day jobs, our vocations, our place in the world, and not just kind of compartmentalizing Christianity as something I do Sunday mornings, and then life is what I do the rest of the time. And so I found my time at Wheaton tremendously valuable. Ashley Woodowis was one of my mentors. He was a political science professor there. Taught a number of really fascinating classes on the law and literature. I remember reading Macbeth and The Prince by Machiavelli, and The Christian Prince by Erasmus, and just loved my time there in the political science department, and also in the English department. I double majored, but I'd say probably the political science classes were most directly applicable to my ultimate vocation in the law.
And kind of a follow-up, are there any classes or professors at UVA that impacted your career trajectory? You also said you had already kind of had an eye on criminal defense or criminal prosecution. And was there anyone that at UVA that kind of solidified that, or maybe made you think twice, or just in general made you think differently?
Yeah, I loved my time at the University of Virginia Law School. It's really a special place. One of my first classes, my 1L year, John Jeffries, who was the dean at the time, taught criminal law, and it was a captivating class. He's a brilliant professor, brilliant legal scholar, and that was a real treat to get to take a class that was so close to my heart, but with such a renowned scholar. John Harrison and Lillian Bevere are also two just renowned law professors there at the University of Virginia, who I took a number of courses from and really benefited from their teaching. John Harrison, in particular, taught federal courts and administrative law. Both of those classes have been very applicable to me, especially now as a federal judge. One of the epiphanies that I remember from John Harrison's courses is that often the answer to a question is a legal question is less important than the who gets to decide what the answer is. And that's really very much what a lot of the federal courts classes are. Is this a question that Congress gets to decide? Is this a question that states get to decide? Is this a question that the president gets to decide, or is this something that has been reserved to the people and away from to the extent that the various governments governing officials cannot regulate it? So that kind of meta question, who decides, was really one of the great takeaways from my time there, and continues to be very important to my current job.
While at UVA, I saw on your kind of bio on the federal justice website that you were also part of FedSoc. I know FedSoc's kind of been both in the news, good and bad. In general, what drew you to FedSoc? That's the Federal Society, outside of just the general philosophy of law, and how was that? How did you find FedSoc at UVA? Like, how did you enjoy it? How did you? Obviously, it's made probably also a pretty big impact on your law profession. Just give us a little bit of detail about that.
Yeah. UVA then, as now, has a thriving Federal Society chapter. It's actually one of the larger and more active student groups in the law school, and it hosts regular, I'd say, several times a month. It will host debates between legal scholars. It'll host lectures. I've actually been back pretty frequently to speak there to law students on various legal issues of the day. And so it provides not only a great opportunity to develop friendships with other young lawyers and law students who are wrestling through legal philosophies and maybe have kind of more of a conservative background, although not necessarily. It also really provides almost a parallel teaching and academic structure. University of Virginia, I think, is fortunate in that it had and continues to have several really terrific originalist law professors, people like John Harrison. But in many law schools, it's very difficult to find an originalist law professor, a law professor who, let alone a law professor who might have kind of more of a conservative background or viewpoint, and so often the Federal Society really steps into the gap there and provides law students an opportunity to hear the other side of the coin and really be challenged and taught about how, frankly, the law and the Constitution is interpreted by arguably a majority of the Supreme Court today, and has been interpreted by courts pretty uniformly for the first 150 years of our nation's jurisprudence.
Yeah, I read an article, or maybe I heard it on a podcast, I'm not sure where, but a law professor was complaining that there needs to be a counterbalance to the Federal Society, and the writer was like, they already have that. It's called faculty meetings. Which I thought was at least a fun dig.
As I say, it varies from every law school is different, but I would say, law schools that are known as kind of more quote unquote conservative law schools are probably law schools that you can actually name more than one originalist law professor. But they tend to be outnumbered in just about any law school around the country.
So you've already mentioned that you were a sheriff's deputy in 2 different localities, correct?
So as a Fairfax County police officer full-time before law school, and then I was a deputy sheriff in Madison County in law school, and for a while thereafter, just on a part-time basis.
So how many other lawyers and judges do you know that have that kind of law enforcement background? That seems like a pretty good counterbalance, right? Or at least the other side of the coin of how law works. I asked because when I had a teacher one time that said the only time you can really understand a sport is if you have played it, if you've coached it, and if you've repped it. So it kind of seems like you've kind of embodied that, where you've been both in private and in public practice, and you now a judge, but you were also a law enforcement officer. How many other judges and lawyers in general have you ever met that have been former law enforcement officers? I know that there are plenty of generally police captains, or even maybe police chiefs that do have a law degree, but I think there is a bit of a difference between a lawyer who has a background in law enforcement versus a law enforcement captain or police chief that has maybe a law degree or has taken.
Yeah, I think you're right that it's pretty unusual. I'm perhaps a little more common among state court judges, but I'm aware of almost no other federal judges who have a law enforcement background, and pretty unusual among the bar more generally, at least in my experience.
And so how did that practically impact your view of the law and your practice of the law? It sounds, I've heard that, that's really where law rubber meets the road, right? Is when you're actually out there either enforcing it or having to make tough decisions. My understanding of your law enforcement training was you were pretty rookie level, or maybe you rose up a little bit, but that's that you have to interact with the public and know how the law is applied in a much more practical and a much more perhaps heated place than the courtroom. So how did that impact your judgeship, or even just your view of the law?
Yeah, so it's certainly helpful, I think, especially as a young prosecutor, where most of my cases involved police officers sometimes almost certainly as witnesses. Sometimes their entire case is made up of one or more law enforcement officers who are testifying to what they observed in their investigation. And so being able to understand what it would be like walking in their shoes, so to speak, I found to be tremendously helpful. From things like understanding the lingo to understanding officer safety concerns that can motivate a lot of officer actions in traffic stops, in search warrant situations, what have you, and is also an important consideration under the law, as interpreted by the Supreme Court, the Fourth Amendment. Your Fourth Amendment rights are robust, but they also have to kind of recognize or take into account legitimate officer safety concerns. And so I think that experience as a law enforcement officer helped me both understand where they're coming from and hopefully be a better advocate. Another way, and certainly now as a judge, having to rule on suppression motions in criminal cases where I'm making a judgment call about whether an officer's actions were consistent with the Fourth Amendment and other constitutional rights. Again, I think that experience, having done traffic stops, done Terry stops, pat downs, and search warrant executions, I think that's probably helpful. It's also just more generally helpful, I'd like to think, as just that type of courtroom experience. My guess is that most lawyers and including most judges have never been a witness in a courtroom. They, have been prosecutors, defense attorneys. You've had those courtroom experiences, but a lot of them have never been a witness and experienced the unfamiliarity, perhaps the stress and intimidation of being cross-examined, and the formality of that process that may feel very natural and normal to a litigator, but can feel pretty foreign for witnesses. But police officers are, of course, regular witnesses. I've testified in hundreds of cases as a police officer, and so I'd like to think that experience makes me attune to the perspective and the plight, if you will, of witnesses in criminal and civil cases.
Awesome. Thanks. Is there a judge, justice, professor, or maybe even layperson that you look to for making tough decisions in the law? I guess asked in another way, is there a person you take your cues from or who you draw inspiration from on your just judicial philosophy?
Well, I think the short answer is there's a number of people who would probably fit that description. One who jumps to mind, though, is Justice Scalia. The late Justice Scalia, I think, is the really foremost proponent and apologist for originalism. Also, just a incredibly brilliant, gregarious, witty man. In law school, I always loved reading his judicial opinions. Often I would skip to them when we had assigned a case, like, what did Justice Scalia say? Not only because of the clarity of his analysis, because of how he said it, it would really be a lot of fun to read. He also was a man of faith, and I think really did a nice job articulating what faith in the marketplace or in the courtroom looks like. So he's probably someone who would be at the at the top of the list there of inspirations or heroes of mine in the legal world.
We're going to take a quick break and have a word from a sponsor. Shenandoah Coffee Roasters has been a staple of Charlottesville since 1993. They offer over 25 varieties of specialty, boutique, and gourmet coffee using only the finest Arabia coffee from all over the world. Coffee is their passion, and they painstakingly search out the best coffee available. Nothing is taken for granted as they continually strive to provide the best coffee they possibly can. They roast all their coffees to order based on the needs of their espresso bar, ensuring that only the freshest and highest quality coffee leaves their roasting house. Grab a cup at any of their 3 locations, Main Restaurant Preston, on the corner, or on Ivy Road, or order a bag online at shenandoahjoe.com.
You've mentioned and even semi-defined it several times already, but could you give us your definition of originalism?
Yeah, so originalism, it's specifically a method of interpreting the Constitution, and it asks what is the original public meaning of the Constitution, and so of a specific provision of the Constitution. It recognizes that words have fixed meanings, and that, or definite meanings, and that they are properly interpreted in a legal context against at the context of the time that the legislation or the Constitution here was passed. And so when you're reading a term in the Constitution or the amendments, you're trying to understand what that term, that right, would have meant at the time that the Constitution was passed, or the amendment was ratified.
Yeah. So you're now a federal judge. I actually watched your hearing in front of the Senate Judiciary Committee, or I watched your parts. But can you just take us through that process, both for you personally and I guess in general, how that?
Yeah. So I have been told by a good friend who knows this process that becoming a federal judge is like getting struck by lightning. There's really nothing you can do to assure yourself that you're going to become a federal judge. There's not a class that you can take or a check-off list. Under the Constitution, the president nominates a federal judge, and then the Senate confirms the federal judge. So there is a process for the White House to consider and select someone for a position, and then a separate process then when it goes to the Senate. In my case, it actually started with a phone call from the White House asking me if I'd be interested in applying for one of the vacancies in the DC District Court. And so I said, wow, I believe, and yes, I would. And so submitted an application, was interviewed by attorneys in the White House counsel's office and the Justice Department. And there's a pretty thorough vetting process that happens with the FBI and the Justice Department as part of that. Once I was one of the lucky ones who was selected, your name goes to the Senate Judiciary Committee. There's a lengthy questionnaire you fill out, just about your background, history, that type of thing. That process then culminates in a hearing that you referenced, where there's one or more nominees who appear in front of the Senate Judiciary Committee. The senators have an opportunity to ask you questions. Then that committee votes on your nomination. If you get favorably recommended from the committee, it goes to the the full Senate, and then the full Senate has to vote on you. So for me, that process took the better part of a year. I was ultimately nominated, I believe, in June of 2017. I had my hearing pretty quickly thereafter, maybe in late June, and then was confirmed at the end of October of 2017.
And yeah, I said your part because your hearing involved two other
I think there was
lawyers
another judge,
appointees.
actually, Judge Kelly, who is one of my colleagues now in DC, and then two nominees for the Justice Department as well. It's a similar process for executive branch presidential appointees, and so for any Justice Department appointees would also go through the Senate Judiciary Committee.
Yeah, I also say I skipped a bunch because you were not grilled very much, at least from my recollection several years ago. There was one or two other people that the Judiciary Committee seemed more interested in getting minutia answers from, whereas they were not interested in you. Let me put it from my recollection.
And I was very, very thankful for that. I think typically someone, I having been a former prosecutor, a defense attorney, often the folks from the kind of with criminal backgrounds, criminal law backgrounds, and especially as federal prosecutors, you're probably less likely to have opined on controversial political issues that understandably raise are more likely to interest the senators. So yeah, I was happy not to have a lot of questions directed my way.
And you got what was do you remember your vote? Do you remember your Senate votes?
I believe it was 84-10. I think there were a few senators who were not present, but yeah, I believe 84 senators voted for me.
Pretty good for a Trump appointee, gotta say.
Thank you.
Yeah. We already mentioned that you went to Wheaton, and very kind of mentioned how Wheaton very much installs you don't just kind of silo your faith on Sundays. It's supposed to be kind of spread out. Shocking that would be taught, but how does your faith impact also your view of law, or your practice of law, or just your philosophy of law?
Yeah, so I guess as I mentioned, Justice Scalia has an interesting speech on this, and he says something along the lines of a good Christian judge is a good judge in the way that a good Christian short order cook is a good short order cook. He just makes a really good hamburger. And I think there's kind of an insight to that Christians shouldn't necessarily be ruling differently. You kind of hope that they wouldn't be ruling differently. I take an oath to the Constitution and to uphold it. But hopefully as Christians, we are, whatever we're doing, whatever our vocation is, we're working at it with all our heart to glorify God, not ourselves. And so I think first and foremost, I'd say being a Christian hopefully means that I am doing my very best to uphold my oath, the judicial oath, and to do my job well. Obviously, being a Christian, you realize that you will one day also appear before the judge of mankind and have to answer for how you've led your life. And so I'd like to think that brings a certain amount of humility and introspection. I think it also influences how we see all the litigants who appear in front of us, recognizing that they are fellow image bearers, and are people who need to be treated with compassion and dignity. So I, on the one hand, I guess I'd say, a Christian judge should be like any good judge. On the other, it certainly my faith does influence my understanding of my role in this world and the weight of the job that I have.
So you are federal district judge in DC. Who is a judge that you're close with on the bench, or maybe kind of a mentor to you, or someone that you just really enjoy working with, or maybe just saying hi in the halls? I'm not really sure what your office mates or building is like, but yeah, just
Yeah. First, I should say it's just becoming a federal judge and getting to work with these other federal judges. It's an incredible honor, and in many ways, this experience is exactly what I would have hoped it would be. That there is this sense of collegiality, of camaraderie between federal judges, regardless of what president appointed you, where you work in the country. We take the same oath, and each of these men and women have dedicated, frankly, their lives to public service, and it is an unusual job where the folks you're working with are going to be. You're going to be working with them probably for the rest of your life, and so there's this sense of camaraderie that I think is really special and unlike what I've seen in any prior job. As I mentioned earlier, I am a former law clerk myself. I clerked for Judge Stephen Colleton on the Eighth Circuit Court of Appeals. He is certainly a role model to me.
Where is the Eighth Circuit, and where were you physically working?
Yeah, so his chambers are in Des Moines, Iowa, and the Eighth Circuit covers much of the Midwest there. Iowa, Missouri, Minnesota, Nebraska. There's a number of those Midwestern states fall under the Eighth Circuit. We'd sit in St. Louis usually to hear cases. So he's a brilliant jurist, really a superb lawyer, and I feel like I learned a lot from him about judging, about writing careful and succinct opinions. So I certainly look to him as a bit of a role model. Number of my on the DC circuit, our court is a little unusual in that in our courthouse we have both the district court, the trial court that I'm a judge on, and then the Court of Appeals also in our building. Greg Katzis, Naomi Rao, Justin Walker were all appointed right around the same time as me, and are also brilliant jurists and great friends to me. On my court, I think there's a great friendship amongst all of the judges. One of the interesting differences between being an appellate judge and a trial judge like me, an appellate judge, you sit in 3 judge panels, or sometimes en banc, that is, the whole court sits together. And so the judges have to either agree or signal their disagreement publicly through dissent. For us on the trial court, where we sit individually, so we're never dissenting, which is kind of nice, at least in the short term. But it also means that we don't necessarily have to kind of fight through differences of opinions in legal cases. We can be resources to one another. But at the end of the day, we're each fully responsible to make our own decisions. And so there's a number of the judges there, especially when I was a new judge, were so helpful to me in giving me advice. I would probably, for the first 2 or 3 years, almost every week, I was calling one of the more senior judges and asking for advice on how to do something, or what is this type of hearing? What should I be thinking about? That I continue to really appreciate the camaraderie amongst my colleagues today.
I know, quite famously, the Supreme Court all gets together on Thursday nights for dinner just to keep that collegiality. Do you and your colleagues do something similar on any level?
Yeah, so we actually just had our annual court dinner earlier this week. That was really a special time to be together with the judges and spouses. Just went out to a restaurant. We also have a dining room back behind the cafeteria in our courthouse that a number of us will just gather a couple times a week. If you're free and in the courthouse, you can find a dozen or so of the district judges there. They're having lunch. So as I say, in some ways, being a district judge is a little more solitary. You're not hearing cases with other judges, and so kind of pros and cons to that. But in some way, I guess one of the cons is you have to work a little harder to actually interact with one another and to make sure you're seeing one another. And so it's been really nice being all in the same building in DC and having that lunchroom as an opportunity to get together regularly.
Cool. Do you have a favorite SCOTUS justice?
So
out of the current 9.
Yeah. Well, without picking favorites, I'll say I became a judge same week as then Judge Amy Coney Barrett. We were confirmed, I think, days apart, and so went through this process of that includes baby judge school together. And I'm just a huge fan of hers. She is a remarkable woman, just a tremendous person of faith, and a wonderful mother. She and her husband Jesse have 7 children, and they're both brilliant and very accomplished lawyers as well. Kind of blows my mind that they're able to do so many things well. And as I suggest, she is just a brilliant judge. I've really enjoyed learning from her and always appreciate her opinions. And so she's certainly up there on any list of mine of favorite judges and justices.
Yeah, I gotta say, at like Gorsuch and Kavanaugh's nominations for the Supreme Court, they just had like binders full of things, and she had a blank notepad. It was
the famous notepad. Yeah, it does kind of encapsulate just her brilliance, her memory, and ability to analyze and respond to very complicated and divergent issues.
Speaking of SCOTUS, is there an upcoming case that you're just generally interested in, that you're just like, oh, this could be super fun because it's like nitpicky law type, or just in general, like, oh, that'd be a really interesting case to argue from an original standpoint, XYZ? Just personal opinion.
Yeah. So I guess a couple come to mind. We just had a Second Amendment case argued, I think earlier this week, Rahimi, that's a really fascinating and important area of the law where the Supreme Court, ever since Justice Scalia's opinion in Heller, are now really wrestling with the Second Amendment and giving an originalist and kind of thoughtful understanding of how the Second Amendment applies to rights to keep and bear arms today. So I'm very interested to see how the Supreme Court resolves that case. That we've also have a couple administrative law cases that are working through the Supreme Court this term. Probably not as high profile or controversial as the Second Amendment, but those have it's a really interesting area of law, and especially for judges on my court. Of course, there are federal courts around the country, but many, not all, but many of the cases that come in DC in particular involve the federal government and often questions about whether the executive branch has exceeded its authority through looking to rulemaking or statutes passed by Congress. And so that these administrative law cases that are coming through this term are likely to have real impact on what we do in DC.
Then kind of a flip side of that question, do you have a favorite niche case? Like just one that, it's not a, for lack of a better term, blockbuster case, one that you're like, oh, this is really interesting, but no one knows about it or people rarely hear about it because it's a niche law case and it's no one outside the law really understands it.
Well, this maybe will not be niche. A favorite of mine has always been Terry versus Ohio, a important Fourth Amendment case. It involves the right of when police officers can conduct stops of individuals on not necessarily on the road, but walking along the sidewalk when they may have probable cause to search somebody or reasonable suspicion to do a stop and pat down. And that case actually involves a detective McFadden. Sadly, I'm not related to him, to my knowledge, but the facts of that case are really fascinating, and it's a case that was quite important for law enforcement and for judges and lawyers in the criminal justice system.
So people have probably noticed that we're a little collegial right now. That's because you actually lived in my parents' basement during law school.
That's right.
And we actually had a Wednesday night ritual where we watched Law and Order. Do you have any favorite law movies or shows that you think are, well, I guess this is a two-part. Do you have any favorite law shows or movies in general? And can you recommend one that you think is most accurate in its depiction of lawyers or the law?
Oh, wow. Let's see. As you say, I do love Law and Order. I really enjoyed that. Enjoy that series. A Few Good Men is just really a fun show, a fun movie. I'm not sure how exactly accurate it is, but really a terrific movie that I've watched multiple times. A movie that this is not so much a lawyer movie, but End of Watch was a cop movie that I think
with Jake Gyllenhaal.
Yeah. I as a former police officer, I thought that movie really wrestled with or went to great lengths to understand what it's like to be a police officer, and it just kind of got some very got a lot of the little things right that you could tell they knew this by doing a lot of consulting with real law enforcement officers. So that's when I've watched it a number of times as well.
And our final wrap up, and this kind of goes back to our original, or back to the start of this conversation, of what materials, books, podcasts, magazines do you recommend to people who want to learn more about the law in general? And I ask that because I'm a big fan of advisory opinions with Sarah Isger and David French. So that's where that kind of question
Sure.
comes in.
Yeah. Well, let me put it this way: some of the books and websites that I utilize a lot. I mean, How Appealing is a website that's an aggregator of legal stories from around the country. I often check that out. SCOTUS blog is another website that keeps pretty close tabs on what's happening at the Supreme Court. Randy Barnett and Josh Blackman have a book that I've appreciated on I think it's like 100 Supreme Court cases that everyone should know. I've appreciated their work. The Heritage Foundation has a Heritage Guide to the Constitution that's kind of a nice compilation of case law, kind of broken down by article of the Constitution, and I think maybe even clauses and the different amendments. So there's a lot of resources out there that I try to use to keep up to speed with what's going on in the law today.
All right. Well, we're brushing up against our time, our hour, and probably very, very busy. So thank you for taking time out of busy day, Judge McFadden. And thank you for being on Church Coffee.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me, Rob. Great seeing you again.
Our album art was done by my wife, and our theme music was composed by TJ Stokes.